Hello and welcome to our webinar, Chile, LatAm's fastest growing solar PV market. My name is Borja Gutierrez and I'm a project manager with Solar Plaza. I'm very happy today to be able to, with three great experts in the industry, talk about the potential and the PV investment opportunities and other opportunities in Chile's in the market in Chile. So today we have three great speakers. I will introduce them in a moment, but we have Adam James from GTM Research joining us, Francisco Leiva from Atesol, and Diana Jensen from OPEC as well. So in a moment you'll have the opportunity to hear from them on their perspectives on the market. So just quickly, for those of you that aren't familiar with Solar Plaza, we are a solar PV-focused global information platform. We provide a number of different services to PV professionals looking to expand projects all over the world. We were founded in 2004, and since then we've carried out over 60 conferences and trade missions all over the world. Currently, actually, this webinar is in fact a prelude to one of our trade missions that we will be doing from the 1st to the 5th of June in Santiago. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But just a few practical notes. The presentation slides and the recordings will be made available, so you don't have to worry about taking notes or anything like that. We will make these available to you shortly after the presentation. Through the software we are using, you're able to ask questions to our panel experts. So if you have questions, you can feel free to use the chat box, which is on the right side of your screens. We do also have technical support available. If you have any problems, you can also use the chat box, and our team will make sure to help you out. If you want more information about the trade mission we're organizing to Chile, you can feel free to check out our website. You'll be able to see this in the slides, and again, we'll provide you with this information. But also, I'd like to introduce our project manager, Saskia Vat, who is available again by email or by phone. Her contact details are available in these slides, and she is managing this project and will be able to answer any questions you have relating to this event. So just quickly to let you know a little bit about the event itself. It's a 5-day trade mission we are organizing from the 1st to the 5th of June. Maybe just quickly some of the highlights of the program. We'll be meeting with key government stakeholders. We'll be holding a number of workshops on some very important issues relating to the development of the PV market in Chile. We'll be talking about the interconnection between the SIC and SING network. We'll be talking about project finance opportunities, meeting with a number of different stakeholders, and of course we will also be holding a conference on the 4th of June in which we'll be inviting over 100 local key players to this event, as well as international key players. Just a few of the involved companies at the moment. You can see in this slide we have quite a big variety of associations, companies, banks, and this is just the beginning. A lot of companies are continuing to join, so feel free to ask us more information about this event. I would like to give as much time as possible to our three expert speakers. They have a very interesting overview of the market, and I'd like to start with introducing our first speaker, which is Adam James. Adam James is actually a solar analyst with GTM Research. We've had the pleasure of working with GTM and with Adam on several events that we've organized throughout the LatAm region. He has a very good knowledge of the whole. I'll actually leave it to him to explain his knowledge, and he will be explaining more about the opportunities and also some of the barriers that exist to project development opportunities in Chile. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Adam. Adam, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
And let me just get the screen. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Adam James. I am a solar analyst, as Laura mentioned, with GTM Research. Just a quick note on GTM Research. We are a market research and data services firm focused on the PV, all aspects of the PV value chain. In particular, I lead our global demand coverage, or our global downstream coverage, and as such, I'm the lead author on the Latin America PV playbook. The reason I mention this up front is because a lot of the data that you're going to see presented over the next 10 minutes is drawn directly from our regular quarterly market research report on this region. So if you have any questions about that, these slides will be available at the end. There's contact information on there for you. So I want to start off before kind of diving into the Chilean market by just couching the Latin America region in terms of the Latin America region, and also kind of giving an idea of where Latin America as a region stands in the broader global context. So the first thing that most people realize when you look at Latin America is that as a share of global demand, it's relatively small. So 1 to 3% of global demand over the next 5 years is expected to come from Latin America. And with that in mind, sometimes it can be a little difficult to understand why it's gotten the amount of attention that it's gotten. And there's a few reasons why I think we've seen so many international companies flocking to Latin America. But 3 of the ones that I would highlight before going into kind of some depth on the Chilean market would be that 1, Latin America is very attractive just as a way to diversify the overall risk portfolio. So about 40% of demand currently is coming from the US, China, and Japan. And all 3 of those markets are very policy dependent. Latin America, on the other hand, is a largely unsubsidized market, and so it presents this opportunity to get involved in a place where you have lower exposure to policy risk. The other kind of key reason that I would point to is just that while our expectations for Latin America are very high, and we've seen triple-digit growth, this will be the 3rd year running in terms of annual growth rates, which makes it the fastest growing region in the history of the world, and that includes regions such as Europe when there were incentives in place and things like that. In annual growth rate terms, Latin America has been the fastest growing region in history. But even with that, there's a huge potential upside for the Latin American market. It has very strong fundamentals, growing population, high insulation, rising electrification, both in terms of increasing rural access to electricity, and also just increasing industrialization in certain places. And so there's this strong foundation for growth. And the reason I mention that is because it's possible that the Latin American region could experience a much more dramatic upside than what we're expecting. And there's really no precedent for the kind of growth that we're seeing in Latin America. There's no precedent for what we should expect out of a market that doesn't have subsidies to rely on. So with that in mind, a lot of companies have started gravitating towards the region. And as I mentioned, we've seen triple-digit growth 3 years running. So that's, that interest is being justified. As you can see here, the Latin American market overall was about 625 megawatts last year. We expect it to be about 2.1 gigawatts this year, drop a little bit next year to 1.8 gigawatts, which is largely due to what's going to be happening in the Chilean market, before rebounding a little bit to 2.7 gigawatts and then up to 3.4 gigawatts in 2018. Overall, that means the Latin American market will reach about 10 gigawatts of cumulative capacity by 2018. The Chilean market, in particular, though, definitely played a leading role in Latin America before declining somewhat. So the Chilean market was only about 8 megawatts in 2013 before rising to almost 500 megawatts last year, which meant that it went from about 6% of the Latin American market to almost 80% of the Latin American market. This year, we expect it to be almost half of the entire Latin American market at almost a gigawatt, before declining somewhat, both in absolute and in percentage terms in 2016 and then out to 2018. So in terms of bigger trends, what this means is that the Chilean market has been very, very important for the growth of the region over this year and last year, but its importance as time goes on is decreasing, not because the market is kind of shrinking to a level that makes it unattractive, but actually because just the rest of the market is growing dramatically, while we expect the Chilean market to stay at about 2016 levels from that point forward. And I'm going to explain some of the reasons behind this over the course of the next few slides. But this is just kind of the big picture to help understand I think the way that Chile fits into the Latin American region. So I want to walk through some of the things that we're kind of expecting from the Chilean market and why. So in other words, what I just showed you was GTM's forecast, but in every forecast there are a set of assumptions that are underpinning that forecast and also a set of variables that could lead to an upside or a downside case. And so I kind of want to lay a few of those out here for you today. So just, in big picture terms, we're expecting about 2.2 gigawatts of added PV capacity over the next 2 years, really, out to 2018. And so what's underpinning that, in part, is strong fundamentals. So currently, there's industrial demand and some commercial demand that is rising. It's about 6 to 7% over the next few years, and most of that is in the SIC grid. But in net terms, what it means is that there's about 12.3 gigawatts of additions that are needed in terms of net capacity out to 2030. I think that's an important number to keep in mind also because the pipeline of PV projects is so large that sometimes it's easy to forget that the total amount of needed capacity is relatively small, and that not all of this will come from solar because you still need some baseload power. Wind is also very competitive, and so it's not all going to come from solar. But there is rising demand, and that's definitely driving a lot of solar procurement to date. The second point is supportive policy. There's a renewable energy target of 20% by 2025. These targets mean very little in and of themselves, but what is important is that they're underpinned in this case by government-led auctions for renewable energy, specifically auctions that have been structured in a way that are advantageous for solar power, where they're auctioning off specific blocks of time during the day. That means that solar is particularly competitive. And that's just a kind of a smart way to structure auctions if you're interested in getting more solar power onto the grid. And just in general, the government is very supportive of renewable energy in general and solar power in particular. The third point is business environment, and this is particularly important in Latin America, where I think one way to think about which markets in Latin America are the most attractive isn't necessarily how attractive are they compared to other countries throughout the world, but how attractive are they compared to their immediate neighbors. And the Chilean market, compared to a lot of its immediate neighbors, is very attractive. It's one of the few countries that has an investment-grade credit rating, which means that it's a lot easier and more attractive for generally for financing. It's also ranked number 4 in the ease of doing business rankings that come out every year from the World Bank, and it's behind Colombia, Peru, and Mexico. And for various reasons, those other 3 markets do not necessarily have the same momentum that Chile has experienced in solar, at least over the last 2 years. So when you combine those two things, it's a very attractive place for companies to do business. And we've seen this materialize with almost 500 megawatts last year, and kind of the influx of financing in the Chilean market that we have not necessarily seen elsewhere. However, with that said, there are still a few barriers in the market. The first one is just net demand and capacity. I alluded to this a little bit, but the grid is about 18 gigawatts. When you have 15 gigawatts or something like that of solar projects that have been permitted, you start understanding that not all of those are probably going to get connected, especially since many of those are focused around very particular nodes. So the net capacity of solar that can be connected is relatively small. So while 12.3 gigawatts of net additions are needed, some of that is driven by retirements, and the total size of the grid is still somewhat constrained. What this means is that this is one of the reasons, at least, why we expect the utility scale procurement for solar to drop off somewhat after 2018 as a lot of those capacity needs are met. The second point that I would point to as a kind of a main barrier is just the hydrological risk and price volatility. When you look at what influences wholesale power prices moving forward, the grid operator doesn't have a high demand, medium demand, and low demand scenario. They have a high rainfall, medium rainfall, low rainfall scenario. So like a lot of other South American markets, the Chilean market, what happens with rainfall and how much hydrological activity there is can severely influence what the pricing environment is like. And the volatility of those prices as well is kind of important to understand. So wholesale prices can spike pretty dramatically in times where there's low rainfall due to increased reliance on thermal power. And in that scenario, you have solar is very, very competitive. But in times of heavy rainfall, the wholesale prices drop pretty dramatically, and solar is not as competitive. So from a pricing standpoint, solar, sometimes it's difficult to understand how solar stacks up against other resources. But the reason that I mentioned the word volatility here is because I think that's actually what's driven a lot of the contracting, that companies who are exposed to those pretty dramatic swings in pricing, even if solar isn't always the most competitive on price, so even if sometimes wholesale prices drop, they're still interested in hedging against that volatility. On the flip side, it means that a lot of the projects that we've seen kind of move forward to date under the merchant model, there's only a few of those that really meet the profile for returns that would be necessary to justify investing in that volatility on the financier side. So for a merchant project that does not have a stable PPA and is kind of linked to that volatility, there's only a few places where the numbers kind of work out for that. So as I'll get to in a few minutes here, I expect the merchant market to kind of drop off somewhat. And the last thing is the kind of section I would call volatility drivers, so what could lead the market to be dramatically higher or dramatically lower than the forecast that we've laid out here. The first one is the distributed generation market. So right now this is underpinned by the new net billing regulations, but net billing has not necessarily incentivized solar in the same way that net metering would. It's kind of become just the functional equivalent of a low feed-in tariff. And there's also not very much financing available, which has limited the impact of the bill and the regulations on the market. So we expect the market to be under 1 megawatt this year and to stay around there over the next few years. However, there is the potential for a dramatic upside there and for more residential and commercial development. And the main factor that would influence that would be changes in the net billing policy or increased access to financing. The second big swing factor is transmission. One of the reasons we expect the market to drop off dramatically after this year and move more towards auctions rather than merchant development, and probably more than even bilateral development, is just due to the fact that there's going to be 2 new transmission lines that are being built, one this year and then one again in 2018. A lot of the pricing, the high pricing that has underpinned solar development, is dependent upon the fact that the grids experience a lot of congestion and are not linked together. Once the transmission lines are built, we expect that will lead to some equilibrium on the pricing side and to levels that are not necessarily a huge disadvantage for solar, but certainly don't underpin the kind of growth that we've seen to date. So we expect some price stabilization. However, I have this listed under volatility drivers because there's also kind of competing interpretations of what could happen. It's possible that prices will rise. And if that's the case, then you can see more solar development than we've expected or laid out here. The last point is natural gas pricing. As with a lot of other markets, because natural gas is the marginal resource with which solar is going to kind of most often be competing, increases or decreases in natural gas pricing will kind of directly compete with solar, particularly in the world of bilateral contracts where large industrial customers are going out to seek a source of power, and they're just looking in terms of price for what can offer them the best deal. So today, solar is beating out a lot of natural gas bids on that basis, but lower natural gas prices would obviously make that more difficult. To close things out, I just want to make 3 predictions for the future of what we expect for the Chilean market. The first one is an increased role for commercial financing. To date, the vast majority of financing has come from development banks. However, we expect that a transition is already underway. There's some large commercial banks who have begun financing solar PV, and we expect for the role of development banks to kind of be phased out over the next few years, and for more and more both domestic and international commercial finance to step in terms of financing large-scale PV projects. The second one, as I alluded to earlier, is that there'll be more bilateral contracts, including those secured through the auction process, and much less merchant projects. This is due to the changes in the transmission network, as I mentioned, that will lead to likely more stable and lower overall prices, and also the fact that a lot of the most attractive merchant projects have already been picked up. So after 2016, it's unlikely that there will be any more of those low-hanging fruit that are really around unless there are significant changes in the pricing environment. And the last one is just growth in the commercial and industrial segment. So in places, other markets that have been heavily dependent on utility-scale generation at first, and I would point to South Africa as a good example of this, what you see is that a lot of developers get brought into the market early on, and then once the market starts to shrink a little bit, either due to a lack of tenders or increased competition, they look around for similar opportunities. And oftentimes the first place they branch out to is the commercial industrial segment, where they can still get some scale, but also have more growth opportunities. And so that's probably a contributing factor to that upside in the distributed generation market that I mentioned. But most of the projects that we would be thinking of here are kind of 250 kilowatts and up. And we do think that there are some large developers who will be interested in exploring this space in the Chilean market much more than they have been to date. So that concludes the presentation that I had together. And I know I'm running up on time here, so I think we wanted to save time for one or two questions. But thanks again, Borja, for inviting me here, and I'm excited to hear some questions.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for your insightful presentation. Indeed, you covered a lot of material in just 10 minutes, and I think you gave us a very good overview of, yeah, exactly where Chile fits into the sort of LatAm regional growth, as well as sort of into a more global perspective. We are getting some questions in, and I'd like to remind also attendees that it's possible in your chat box to ask questions to our presenters. A couple questions have actually come in relation to the role of energy storage in Chile. So I'd like to ask you actually if you see a role for energy storage in future project development, and if so, what that is.
Yeah, well, we've seen some of the bids and the auction process kind of for combined PV energy storage projects. We've seen, the molten salt storage and the CSP and things like that have kind of had some traction as well, largely due to the fact that the insulation levels are so high that it's possible to make that work. I mean, I think that in general our take on energy storage right now is that it still is very difficult to get a business model moving for energy storage independently of any other resource. And that's true in more mature markets like Germany and the U.S. So that's going to kind of be exacerbated somewhat in the Chilean market. So, I would say that it's not something that we have kind of built in as one of our assumptions in the base case. It's not something that I see really being a significant driver in the next few years. But it's definitely one of those factors that I would peg as being an upside driver in the Chilean market. It's possible that it could increase the outlook dramatically. This is one of those interesting situations also where the way that the Chilean government has structured the auctions to have certain blocks of time offered means actually that the value proposition for storage is less significant. Because if you only have to bid, for example, for a window of time between noon and 4 p.m., then you have no need for energy storage in order to kind of round out or firm up your bid. But in other auctions where you have to bid for a full day time block or something that runs until 7 or 8 p.m., then you could find that storage would be more influential. So in other words, I think that in the way that they've structured the auctions has made energy storage less of a requirement, but that if it were to gain commercial viability and more traction, that could definitely be an upside driver to consider.
Thanks for your answer, Adam. Another question actually that's coming in. One of the things that you mentioned that you see potential growth in the commercial and industrial sectors. I was wondering, and a lot of other people seem to be wondering, where's the role of mining, the mining industry? Is there a lot of potential for the development of solar projects related to mining?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the mining industry is one of the key industries in the Chilean market, and so when you look at where does demand come from, mining is always going to play a huge role. There's a few things that make mining projects difficult. One would be that mining companies are very hesitant to lock in long-term contracts because the operations of their mines are linked to the prices for the commodity that they are mining. So there are times where commodity prices dip and they just shut down operations. They don't want to be locked into any kind of a long-term contracts in that situation. So sometimes it can be difficult to get them to sign longer-term contracts. The other thing that I would point to is that a lot of these mines are out very far from other energy sources in the desert, which is one of the reasons why they're so interested in getting access to kind of like new energy. But the other thing that means is that the case for just developing solar is not always the strongest case for them because solar doesn't always produce power, especially without storage. Solar doesn't always produce power. And so what that means is that when there's operations that are going on, they need a continuous supply of power in order to maintain their operations. So for a lot of the mining companies, they're thinking of it solar as part of a portfolio of options that they should be pursuing, but they're also looking at other resources as well. So I would say in the case of the mining sector, solar it actually has a little bit more of an uphill battle than it does, for example, in the auction process where the tenders that they're receiving are just to supply large distribution utilities who can balance solar against other resources. With that said, I mean, we've seen tons of solar PPAs signed with mining companies. So those aren't insurmountable obstacles, but they are obstacles that are worth definitely kind of keeping in mind as you think about where is going to be the primary source of new demand in coming years.
Great, thanks, Adam. This is very interesting to hear your perspectives on especially I think the future of the market and the barriers as well. We're going to come back to you again in when we have some more discussion topics. We do still have some unanswered questions that I think we will be coming back to later. But I would like to move on to our next speaker, which is Francisco. Again, thanks, Adam, and speak to you again soon. Francisco, do you hear me?
Hi, Borja. I hear you.
Hi, Francisco. Thanks very much again for joining us. So just a quick introduction. Francisco is the Vice President of Asesol, as well as being the Business Energy Manager in Hirod. He has a very interesting, I think, profile experience working in the energy sector in several markets throughout Latin America, as well as Nigeria and obviously Chile, where he's from. So thank you very much for joining us, Francisco, and we look very much forward to your presentation. So please go ahead.
Okay, good evening to you all. Well, the contents of my presentation, you can see it. First, as you know, Chile has a huge solar energy resource. The potential of solar resources are around 1,200,000 hectares of territory. We have high solar radiation, near 10 kilowatt hours per square meter per day. And we have the best sky clarity in the region. That is the reason why the main astronomical observatory are installed in our country. The potential for photovoltaic power plant is around 240 gigawatts, and for concentrated solar plants we have around 150 and 480 gigawatts. Huge solar resource. Well, in this graph I show you the horizontal daily solar radiation for 5 cities. The first 4 are the Chilean cities: Calama in the north, Santiago, the capital, in the center. Temuco and Puerto Montt are in the south of Chile. The red line shows the radiation for Sevilla, the Spain city, where Spain has a huge development of solar projects. Look the graph, the radiation of Sevilla is very similar to Santiago, the capital, in the center of the country. It's necessary to note that Sevilla is in the opposite side of the world. That is the reason why the curve is opposite to the other lines. Well, but Calama is named the solar city of South America. Calama has huge solar resource. Look, that has a minimum of 5 kilowatt hour per square meter per day, and a maximum near 9.5 kilowatt hours per square meter per day. Then we have a very optimistic development for the next years. It's a view a little different from the opinion of James. Well, The regulation of the solar energy projects is led by the general law and his regulation, and also the law that controls the environment issues and his regulation, obviously. For thermal solar energy projects, we have the law and his corresponding regulation. And for PV solar energy projects, we have a couple of laws with his corresponding regulation. Well, what are the main factors that contribute to demand for solar energy-based solutions? First, high cost of energy. The marginal cost now currently is around $140 per megawatt hour. Our country is an electric energy intensive use. All the companies and industry are searching for independence from the current energy providers. Obviously, everybody has a better knowledge of current possibility in these renewables, and obviously we have a high solar radiation available. Well, in this table, I show you the potential market of for thermal solar energy. Look, the red cycle, the total square meter for thermal solar solutions are around 150,000 square meter per year for the 2014, last year. Well, this potential is starting, and I believe that in 2015 the market is going to grow a lot. Well, for photovoltaic solar energy, the government has a commitment to reach 20% to 2025. The other potential markets are current generators and distributors company, and obviously free customers. Obviously, the spot market is an important market too. And recently, the government got the approval for the generation distribution. Then there are a very recently market that is very low at this moment, but we expect that 2015 this market grow a lot. Well, the main market at this moment is the demand mainly for free customer and regulators customers. You can see in this graph the demand forecast. The government in this month, April, is going to launch a new bidding process with the proposed to cover around 13,000 gigawatts hour. Then it's the most attractive bidding process for the moment. Everybody is waiting for this process. In the next graph, you can see the red line, that is the demand line of power. The blue bar are the current contracts, and the green bar are the recently bidding process that the government launched past years. The pink zone is the future bidding process that the government is going to cover with a bidding process. Then is the most attractive for potential provider of power solutions. Everybody is looking for this bidding process. Okay. Well, let me explain what is the Chilean government thinking. They are thinking to call for a bidding process now, this month. The capacity is around 13,500 gigawatts hour. They are keeping in mind different deadlines for these contracts. The energy blocks have different size too. The expected selling price is lower than $120 per megawatt hour. In the last bidding, the average price of the providers, of the bidders, was around $107 per megawatt hour. The idea is to receive offers in March of the next year, 2016. And the later date of supply is January 2021. Obviously, this is very attractive because the bidding process keep in mind very flexible conditions that facilitates that providers can elaborate his tenders. Okay. Well, let me show you the current status of the renewables projects in Chile in megawatts. The figures are in megawatts. Look, the solar photovoltaic row, for instance. Now we have 516 megawatts in operation. In construction, we have 1,047 megawatts. But look at his figure. We have 8,352 megawatts with environmental approval. E.g., those projects are ready to build. And in process for qualification, we have 4,866 megawatts. Then there are a lot of people that has a project, approved project, but they are waiting for a PPA or for finance. Well, that is the energy matrix composition to March past months. Renewables represents 9% of our energy matrix. Remember that's for 2025. The government is expecting to get 10%. Solar is growing, but is very low yet. Well, let me show you the power price evolution. If you see the first months of this year, the average price in the system is around 90 and $100 per megawatt hours. This average price is represented by the segmented line. Remember that Chile has a true interconnected system. The red line shows the price of the north, the interconnected system in the north, and the blue line shows the central interconnected system. But the average are the segmented line. Well, the other potential market is net billing, is the distributed generation. Recently, the government, a couple of months, the government got the approval of the law that's lead the distributed generation. This is a very interesting market. It's starting, at this moment it's starting. and we expect that this grow up very fast. Well, what are the success critical factors from my point of view? First, economic viability. There are a demand that is growing. There are a lot of providers, Chilean providers, Spanish providers, American providers, European providers. Financing, at this moment, Chilean banks has a line of financing for this kind of projects. We have a strong legal and regulatory frames, and obviously the government is the main support for the development of renewables. Well, this last slide shows what is the Asesol's vision for the energy solar markets. Okay, this is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for your detailed presentation. It was very interesting to understand what your overview of the market and the opportunities. We have a lot of questions coming in relating to the issue of the prospects for PPAs versus merchant solar. Where do you see the opportunities developing in future years?
Well, in the next years, the main market obviously is related with the bidding process that the government is going to launch to provide electric supply to distributors company. This is very attractive because the time of the contract is 20 years. Well, this is the most attractive at this moment market that everybody is looking at.
Thank you. Also, one other.
That's my answer.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much. One other question we have also relating to local financing. Can you tell us maybe what type of local debt financing is available? Are there local banks involved in financing solar projects, and what are the perspectives for that in the future? The prospects in the future?
Well, obviously you have local finances opportunities. At this moment, we have 2 or 3 banks that are working very hard with the renewables market. Obviously, the financing is easily to get for projects that are 5 megawatts and up. Low installed capacity for project is very difficult to get finance. But the border is 5 megawatts. And obviously, most investor and family office from European family office are looking to finance renewables projects in Chile. As Vice President of Asesol, I had a meeting with several investors and family office searching opportunities in Chile.
Thank you very much, Francisco. And maybe we'll hear more about financing as well from Diana in a moment as well. But thank you for providing, especially the prospect, the local perspective as well. But one last question, maybe also in relation again to mining. We see a lot of action from I think especially Codelco in terms of how much time is being spent on developing PV projects. Why do you think that some of the other mining companies are slower? And do you see opportunities in that market?
Obviously, yeah. Let me explain what is the mining sector situation currently. At this moment, the copper price is low, is go down. Then mining companies are searching to reduce his cost. One of the main costs of the mining process is energy. Then for this year, 2015, I expect that mining company search more opportunities to reduce his cost of energy. At this moment, the mining sectors has very low, reduced contracts, few contracts at this moment. Then I expect that 2015 is the start of the consecution of the to get more PPA from local provider, from renewables providers. Okay. At this moment, the strategy that mining companies are show me your projects under construction, and then come to discuss a possible PPA. It is not possible at this moment to get a PPA if you can't show the construction of your renewable projects. Remember that I show you. Look, we have 8,352 megawatts in approval projects. If you consider an average of 40 megawatts plants, you have around 200 potential providers. Then it's very difficult for mining companies to discuss with 200 potential providers. Then mining companies are demanding that you show that your product is under construction, and then to discuss for a possible PPA. Is my tip for this audience.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Francisco. Yeah, no, you've provided some very interesting insight on the opportunities, and thank you very much. And we'd like to move on to our third speaker, which is Diana Jensen from OPEC. She is Managing Director of Renewable Energy Finance. OPEC has been financing projects in Chile. I'll let Diana tell you more about how OPEC was involved. But Diana's also held positions as VP of Finance and U.S. Operations with Azure Power. So she has a very good overview of both from the the finance perspective, from as a business developer and financing. So Diana. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Thanks very much for joining us, Diana. Yes, perfectly. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass the role of presenter to you now.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, we can see your screen. Thank you, Diana. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Thank you, Borja. Thank you for including me. I'm just going to start with a very quick overview about OPEC for those listening who aren't familiar with the institution, and then get into our experience more specifically in Chile. So OPEC is essentially the U.S. government's development finance institution. Our mission is to help facilitate U.S. capital investments in emerging markets, and also to facilitate development in those markets. So the transactions that we support are almost always on a project finance basis, always in an emerging market. We need to have U.S. equity as part of those transactions, and so they're typically joint ventures, and depending on the size can range anywhere from a 2 megawatt type of project, I mean specifically obviously for power, up into hundreds of megawatts, and either with OPEC lending on its own or lending alongside other development finance institutions. We can lend up to generally no more than 250 million or 300 million per project. So currently we have a portfolio of about 18 billion in over 100 countries. And all of our projects, we encounter all sorts of stakeholders. In the earlier days of OPEC's operations, predominantly OPEC was working specifically with one developer in the energy sector. But today it's changed a lot. Not only the size of the projects has changed a lot, but the players have changed a lot. We work a lot more alongside impact investors, alongside even development and other finance institutions. And also in a lot of investment funds that are coming in and investing in the sector. So as you can see on this screen, it goes from working directly with the project developers and also having other investors such as foundations, VC firms, etc. And also working alongside other U.S. government agencies that might provide technical assistance support to projects and so forth. And then moving on, so last year we did 1.2 billion in renewable energy commitments, and and that was represented basically 50% of all OPEC commitments for renewable energy. So there's been a dramatic change in our portfolio from almost nothing, I would say, in 2008 to 2009, to renewable energy presenting a majority of what we're working on. This is just gives you a sense of where we are focused in terms of technology in our portfolio. You can see the majority of the work in renewable energy on OPEC side is in solar, with also a large section there with wind generation. And on the next slide will also show the commitments by region. So this is just for our last fiscal year. You can see that Latin America and Caribbean dominates. So Latin America and Caribbean and solar, and that was largely for our solar projects in Chile. Here you can see a summary of those projects. So we've worked a lot, as you can see, with SunEdison. We've worked with for solar, and also with SunPower, Total, Etriano, and Solventus in one project. And those projects, as you can see, ranging from 50 megawatts up to the Luz del Norte project, which is 141 megawatts. And this totals approximately 430 megawatts we supported in solar for a total exposure of about $640 million. Of all of these projects, the first three are commissioned. The first one, the San Andreas project, was commissioned just about a year ago, as was the 100 megawatt Amanecer project, which will be a year in June. And then the 70 megawatt Salvador project was commissioned in January of 2015. And then the Maria Elena and Luz del Norte projects are still currently under construction. And in all of these projects, you can see, with the exception of the Salvador project, we worked alongside other lenders. For the SunEdison projects, we worked alongside in Bank and Corbanca, and then, of course, with the Luz del Norte, also with the IFC. So in essence, I think what we've seen with these projects is that the structuring these projects around the merchant system is very challenging. And essentially what happens is, the lenders structure the project so that during the merchant portion, with the idea that the projects will move to a PPA. So PPAs aren't granted until the projects are under construction, and so we model a much more conservative scenario, and the project is subject to more stringent lender requirements during the merchant portion of the project life. So in the beginning, what lenders will likely do is have higher ratio, have cash sweeps, lower the leverage, maybe have higher reserves, and so the lender will try to benefit from any upside in cash during that period of time before you have the certainty of a PPA with a set a set tariff. And so, in all these projects, obviously, we've all seen a lot of development in the Atacama Desert, in these projects, and all of these projects are located in that region. And so, I think there's been some discussion about whether or not maybe there's been an overdevelopment, and some of this has happened, I think, a bit faster than people anticipated. And right now, with diesel and oil prices having come down a bit, the merchant prices, of course, are impacted by that. So there are, I think, some challenges for developers who are sort of subjected to more stringent structuring around merchant projects. And looking forward, we obviously have committed a lot to the country in solar, and we would be very judicious in looking at future projects and weigh how much additional exposure OPEC might be willing to take in the Chilean market. So that essentially concludes my comments on our support and sort of where we're seeing the project. I mean, as you can see, all of these are relatively new in the life cycle of the project, so there's still a long road ahead for all of these.
Thanks, Diana. Yeah, thanks very much for sharing, your experience in the market, and yeah, I'd like to talk. One of the questions that seems to be coming in, that has been, phrased in different ways, but basically, I think people want to know is OPEC still, considering looking at financing other merchant projects in the same region or in Chile in general? Are there prospects for future financing of these projects?
I think we're going to look at it, very carefully, because this is a significant amount of exposure in one sector and in one country for us. So I think there are a couple projects that have currently come in that we are looking at it, but I think we'll be very careful, and I think the exposure levels will have to be managed, because it is getting to be quite high.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. Also, I mean, in relation to a bit of a follow-up question, I mean, we kind of heard from some of the other speakers that potentially the role of development banks might somewhat phase out. Do you think that that's the case? I mean, is there more financing now coming from commercial banks? Are they taking a larger role now from your perspective?
I think, that is sort of the natural progression, and that is really, at the end of the day, what OPEC and the other development financial institutions want to see. I mean, the idea is that these institutions come in potentially earlier stage and take more risk than commercial banks are willing to take, but as the market matures and solidifies, then, that really is the idea, that the commercial banks should take over, and they should be the ones then lending into these markets. So yes, I mean, we hope that that progression continues, and I think that people will probably have to think a little bit more, though, about the development of the market with respect to merchant deals or PPA types of transactions, because the merchant deals obviously do present more risk, and that's and requires a lot more thinking around the structuring. So to the extent that there are PPA-type transactions, I would think that commercial banks, would be prepared in this market to lend to those types of projects.
Great, thanks. And then, one last question in relation to this. In terms of equity investment, I know you've, on several of your projects, you seem to have worked with some equity investors. What do you see the role, and maybe, yeah, and especially sort of moving forward, do you see a role for foreign investors, or do you, in terms of equity investment, do you see more of a role for local or foreign investors, and how does OPEC work with these investors on your projects?
So for us to work with investors that are not U.S., we need to have a joint venture. So, for instance, if a solar developer a U.S. solar developer was to undertake a project with other investors, or alternatively, if it was a foreign developer, but maybe they had investment from a U.S. investment fund, that would qualify. And we more often now see that our U.S. participation in projects can come from a U.S. investment fund. And based on what, my understanding of some of the approvals in the market recently, it sounds like, China's Sky Solar, has an intention of developing a number of projects, and as well as Actis and some other developers. So we can work with foreign developers, but we have to identify some U.S. equity in that transaction that meets our requirements, or long-term U.S. participation in some form, if it, for instance, as an EPC contractor or an O&M contractor.
Thanks, Diana. Yeah, thanks very much for your again for your great answer. I have another question. I'd like to kind of go back to Francisco, if you're still there. One of the questions that people are asking in terms of opportunities for foreign companies in Mexico. I know that that investors are sorry. So Francisco, can you hear me actually?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, you were muted there. We had a small technical issue. But so, what do you see? Do you still see a role for new foreign project developers or other types of stakeholders to come in? There seems to be a feeling that perhaps the market is already flooded. That a lot of companies are there already. Is there a role for new companies entering the market?
Well, I know that at this moment there are a lot of people looking for the new bidding process, and this interest is growing because the two interconnected systems now are separated, but the government launched a process that allows to connect both interconnection systems. Then all the huge solar resources in the north, you are going to develop solar projects and transmit the energy in the north to the central and to the south. Then the market is going to change very drastically if you compare with the previous years. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Francisco. I think that's a good. So there's still the opportunities, I think, for new companies looking to come in. One last question for Adam. In relation to, I guess maybe following up on this, how do you see I mean, what type of advice would you give to companies looking to enter the market, especially I think companies that perhaps do have this view that there aren't necessarily many avenues for new participation. Do you have any specific advice you would give to any potential investors, project developers looking to enter the Chilean market?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I think that the auction process is definitely still a very open opportunity for any companies who are looking to get involved in the market. If you're looking to develop kind of projects under the bilateral model, or just kind of go out and seek PPAs directly with commercial off-takers, I think that bundling solar with other resources and kind of going in with a package is probably a good strategy at this point. I think that would help to mitigate a lot of the concerns. And then the last point that I would make maybe is that I think in order to kind of be competitive in a market that's getting as crowded as Chile, and in order to overcome some of the barriers that are there, you just have to get a little bit more creative, and so that may mean having shorter contract terms, using contracts for difference, and other kind of financing mechanisms like that in order to assuage off-taker concerns while making bets on what direction the market is headed. Admittedly, that involves taking on, asking financiers to take on more risk than you would have in a traditional PPA. But I think in a competitive wholesale market like Chile, you have energy traders and other players who could play a more active role in the solar market. So those would be the three things that I would point to that kind of that I think could help make the difference in an already pretty crowded market.
Thanks very much, Adam. I think those are definitely some very good tips for those that are looking to enter the market. One last question for Diana. Sorry, I was muted there for a moment. Yes, one final question that we have. Thanks, Adam, for your answer. One final question for Diana. Could you maybe just briefly explain to us, a finance organization, development bank like OPEC, what sort of advice would you give to people looking to get their projects financed? I mean, what types of advice, what types of things do you look for as a potential financier of projects?
Well, I think it's important to time your discussions with a lender at a point where you have a fairly well-developed concept. I think projects get bogged down when developers don't have a good sense of the kind of detailed information a lender is going to be looking for. So I think it's important to have a really solid business plan, to have identified who your partners are going to be in the project, to demonstrate the amount of work that's gone into feasibility and design and so forth, and that the project is at a fairly mature stage. Generally, OPEC won't get into discussions or into much analysis on a project until it's clear that the equity investors have been identified and that most of the sort of pre-development work, feasibility work has been completed. So, it's not to say you can't have a conversation with someone earlier in the process, but at the point you feel like you want a lender really to engage is the point at which you need to really have a lot of the information pulled together, identification of land, maybe draft agreements and so forth and so on. So I would say, initiate the conversations early to understand if the lender has room in the market or an interest in the project. But then when you really want them to engage, you should be, prepared to deliver a lot of information.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Diana. I'd like to thank actually all three of you for participating in this webinar, Diana, Francisco, and Adam. It was very interesting to hear your insights in the market. I think that in a fairly short period of time, we've managed to sort of start delving into some of the interesting market drivers and some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that we see in the market. So thanks again to all three of you for joining us. We do look forward to going into more depth on these topics during our trade mission to Chile in June. So again, from the 1st to the 5th of June, you can see the website for the event is online. So for those of you that are interested in getting to know the market better, meeting some of the key stakeholders, and also expanding your network and looking for project development and financing opportunities, feel free to get in contact with us. Again, Diana, Francisco, Adam, thank you, all three of you, for joining. It was a real pleasure. And I look forward to seeing all of you soon. And thank you very much again.
Thank you, Borja. Thanks for including me.
Thank you. Have a nice evening or day, depending on where you are.
Thank you very much, Borja.
Thank you, Francisco. Thanks, Adam.